Welcome to the weekly Wednesday Savage Worlds GM Hangout on air, sponsored by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's topic, Adaptation, bringing in popular movie franchises and settings into Savage Worlds using just pretty much the core rules. Here to discuss it, as always, Chris, the Savage Mommy, hashtag Pussy Grab.
I'm back.
Dave, the rules man, Scott.
Greetings and salutations.
And old man Jim Tryon from the Happy Jacks RPG.
What?
So tonight, hashtag everybody's moving to Canada. That'll be the extent of our political discussion. We just want to talk about, because I see a lot of posts on the Google Plus, the G Plus community. Oh, I'm thinking of starting a Star Wars campaign. Or, oh, I'd like to run an Indiana Jones style campaign. Oh, I want to run a campaign set in the world of Firefly. Where's my conversion document? Where do I go on the internet? What setting book should I steal from to make that happen? And the answer is none of them. Savage Worlds Deluxe Core, with a little bit of imagination, will do it for you. That's not to say that there aren't some excellent setting rules that are genre specific in other published settings, such as Slipstream or Deadlands, for example, if you want to really focus on dueling or gambling or hanging. But none of those rules that exist really need to be gleaned from a published setting. They can be imagined and adjudicated with the core rules. Like, for example, let's give an example. Is anybody familiar? Because I know at least two of the hosts here are avid Deadlands fans. What are the setting rules for hanging in Deadlands, for example?
I've never used them, so I have no idea.
I've never used them either. Hold on, I'll find out. It's never come. We never had a lynching, although might have to now. I believe it's a series of vigor rolls.
I think so. Would make sense.
And a much steeper penalty.
Well, I think it would be vigor rolls, and every time you fail, you take a wound.
I think so, but I think there's also a rule in there for things like if you're actually dropped, there's the snap of the neck one that has like a massive penalty. And I believe there might even be a penalty for like if people are pulling on you or hitting the rope or something.
All right, well, let's say we don't have Deadlands handy, right? So I need a rule for hanging them. Just kind of think as a GM, what's the effect similar to? And you can say the effect is similar to drowning. It's asphyxiation. Drowning.
Yeah.
You can always just use the standard drowning rule. Every round they make a vigor roll, and if they fail, they suffer a level of fatigue until they're incapacitated. And incapacitation could just equal death. I mean, it could be literally that simple.
Mm-hmm.
And every level of fatigue you take adds a -1 up to 2. Once you cross the 3rd, good night, nurse. You're done.
And depending on how you want that moment to play out at your table, it could be just a series of really quick dice rolls. It could drag out into a full dramatic task. You might want to take that moment to have that gravitas of drawing the card, flipping it face up on the table, and describing the character hanging there, doing the jig, their boots up in the air, dancing the jig at the end of the long rope. You might want to have that gravitas of the moment, so you go with a dramatic task. Whereas you might want to just have it be a quick over and done and have it be a single dice roll of, did you survive the drop? Okay. Now you get so many rounds based on your vigor that you can hang there, and then you're going to start giving me a roll every round not to pass out from fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
And your friends have to obviously go furious and fast to try to save you. But I think it all depends on what you want from that moment. If you also want just a over and done, there's no one coming to save you, you've been walked up to the gallows, you might just hand the player an extra Benny for their starting new character and let them just describe the scene of their hanging. Because at that point, if there's no one coming to the rescue, they're gonna die.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and also too, we don't have the benefit of Google Hangout Q&A anymore. So if you're watching this live and you have a question, send your emails to savagedaddy@gmail.com. Go ahead, Jim. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I was just I was going to say you could, in that moment, if like you're being marched up to the gallows and there's nobody coming, there are 150 federales standing around, just waiting to shoot anybody who even twitches. So there's nothing going to say. Just like, okay, player, how does this play out? You tell me. And then that's a matter of having trust between you and your player that your player is going to go with what's happening, and not going to do some weirdness.
Well, and I think, funnily enough, I think if your player gets to that point where they take it off the rails, they've got the character that's going to dart for their life, you go with that
You
and
play
then
it.
roll them in a combat tracker with 150 federales or 50
Right, you play it
federales,
out.
whoever. If you just described the scene that there's 50 guys with guns trained and you're being marched up to the gallows, and then your player decides he's going to bolt for it, let him.
Yeah.
Stop
No,
him.
you play it out how it plays out, but I have no problem handing that narrative control to the player. But that's my players too. That's the players that I get. There are players I've had in the past that I'd be like, yeah, no, no.
And I would hope that the player has some idea that this might be coming.
Yeah.
Because just springing it on them.
This should have been set up and taken.
Make sure that you've got it set up, but I would make sure that they know that this is a possible outcome of the consequences of whatever's going on in the story.
If you think about it, and I'm going to apologize if anybody's a Black Sails fan and hasn't watched this far. Spoilers!
I know the scene you're getting ready to do.
Stop watching now.
A main character gets hanged by the neck until dead. But they have...
Is it Sean Bean? Is the actor Sean Bean?
No, Sean Bean's not in it.
Oh, disappointing.
But the actor does do a Sean Bean-esque delivery of a death scene. It's
Okay.
Oh, yeah. It's beautiful and brilliant. But you have the imprisonment. You have time in prison, in jail. You have all manner of drama going on about that. You have the trial. You have... time after the trial. You have stuff going on. There's all kinds of drama and whatnot. And then you have the hanging.
And you have the party of adventurers ready to save said hero when they're being hanged, and the hero waves them off.
Right. The hero waves them off.
You hand that moment to your player, and you might have the player who wants that big heroic death in front of the rest of the party to galvanize them and set steel in their spines so that they can do whatever that next scene that's coming up is.
Right.
And then you can have them introduce a brand new character and be right along with everybody because they were one of the people standing in the crowd to watch this.
Yeah.
And now they're going.
And I probably would have had an out-of-game conversation with the player saying, hey, this is where this is going. How do you want this to go? How do you want this to go narratively for your character? And some players are going to be like, yeah, I want to find a way to get out of this. I'm like, okay, you know what? We'll find a way to make that work. Mm-hmm. We'll find a way to make that happen.
Well,
or you might have a player who goes, you know what? I want that moment. I want that death. I want that to happen. So, and we'll go with that. At which point I'm going to be like, make sure you have a character ready.
Well, I would say this too: that if we're going to have a hanging scene in our game, it's kind of a conceit and foregone conclusion that there's going to be the arrow let loose that cuts the rope, that drops him back onto the horse. There's going to be one of the conceits of even setting that up is that there's going to be the heroic rescue. Now, I understand what everybody else is saying. If this is a moment where you want the hero to make the decision to sacrifice himself nobly, then yeah, have the court trial. Have the long imprisonment. Lead up to this is a huge moment for gravitas. If this is just your typical run-of-the-mill, you will be hanged because your dog peed on our plant and you're on an alien world and you didn't know the law. Yeah, just run it real quick. And I'm going to throw this out here. Here are the hanging rules from Deadlands. If a character is first dropped a few feet, usually from horseback or the gallows, he makes a vigor roll -2. Failure means his neck snaps and he's dead. A critical failure does exactly what you think it might. Though if you're being hanged, you weren't using the noggin of yours anyway, were you? Blah, blah, blah. Assuming you survive the first vigor roll, you make a vigor roll at a -4 every minute or suffer a level of fatigue until you're exhausted. So that's the official rule for hanging. Deadlands, pretty damn close to what we said. It's treated as drowning.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Now, interestingly enough, we actually had this scene come up for an NPC in my Pirates game a while back, where the players had the option to rush up and try to save him, and they failed miserably at most of the attempts to do so, other than just running up and cutting him loose after he made that successful vigor roll to save his own life from the initial drop at the gallows. That moment played out in the scene the way it did, the players found themselves in an immediate conflict. But had that been another player, there'd have been a processional scene in front of it that led to that moment. And I think that's the key part here is once you get to that moment where the player character is the one that's having that noose put around their neck, that's where I think that adult conversation does need to occur, and you need to let them know, hey, this is very much a you die scene. We need to figure out how that's going to play, and if the player wants to try to survive, we'll play that out at the table. If the player doesn't want to survive, then absolutely roll up the extra character. I'll grant you a Benny in the moment to narrate your death, and you pick right up with the new character. You know, scene doesn't have to end at all for anybody. I think that's an interesting thing. But what we're talking about in the topic tonight, I don't think should be something that's that easy to point to. You know, there are rules for hanging. There were rules for hanging 10 years ago in the Pirates book. There's rules, obviously, in Deadlands that have replaced those. But what about those scenes that there isn't an effective rule for? Like the samurai duel on the sandy beach at sunset. What about moments like the dim mock? There aren't necessarily official rules for those things.
You're right. There are not official rules for them. However, I can think of some rules that could be adapted very easily.
And that's what I'm saying. That's more what our topic is tonight, is it not?
Right. And so since we went there, and I'm totally good with that. If I was going to do a samurai duel on the beach or a lightsaber duel, here's where I think I would go with it, and you guys can then go with where you guys would go with it. Deadlands has great rules for doing gun duels in the street that you could adapt easily to do either to do like a samurai duel or a joust or a lightsaber duel or something like that.
I think it would take a little forethought on the GM's part. I don't think that's one where you're going to flip to that in Deadlands and be able to run it at your table without thinking about it ahead of time. Mostly because the Deadlands version does deal heavily with some stats that really only exist in Deadlands. But I think those are some great rules.
Well, we picked up on one thing. This is something we kind of discussed pre-show, lightsaber duels. So let's talk about the Star Wars lightsaber duel. Does that need to be a combat? No, absolutely not. Because, and here's why, the duel is a dramatic, cinematic moment in the franchises. There's more talking and back and forth drama going on in a lightsaber duel than there are lightsaber strikes in a lightsaber duel. Well, it's about two people showing each other down, meeting and facing each other. It's not about cutting people's arms off.
Well, see, and I think that for me is the bigger aspect of this is whenever we see the lightsaber duel, the rest of the cast has fallen to the wayside. And we all know that moment at the gaming table is either pure gold because everyone's sitting on pins and needles paying attention to what's being described, or it's the most horrendous agony where everybody gets up and goes makes a sandwich because now they've been left out of 5, 10, 20 minutes of gameplay at the table. And I think that's why having something like a duel mechanic or some of the stuff that we talked about in the pre-show that we'll get to in a minute are important, because there's more reason for the other players to want to pay attention. Whereas if it's a duel between Chris and I, Jib and you might as well get up and leave the room while he and I just run through a combat, because it's watching us both make combat rolls and the occasional, auditory jab at each other isn't gonna be necessarily fun.
Okay, I'm gonna throw this out here. What do you guys think of a lightsaber duel as a social conflict using fighting instead of persuasion?
I can see that.
You could also run it as a dramatic task and use the chase complication table when a complication shows up.
Well, I would
say that would be more to my liking. I guess I'm just kind of boring because I would run it as a combat. I look at the combat between Darth Maul, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Obi-Wan. To me, that was a combat, but it was almost like a chase because they were all over the place,
right.
and you could use the complications very easily in that. So I like that.
Well, and I was even gonna go so far as to say use the chase rules.
Yeah, you could use the chase rules.
Go back to our episode a few episodes back where we talked about the chase and how the different range increments stop being range increments and start just being penalties to the dice roll. And you have your chase scene, which determines you were this far out of position based on, whatever about the footing of the area that you guys are moving through. Describe that, and now give me your combat rolls. That would be an interesting way to handle it. My only problem with running it as a combat is it's amazing as a combat. Savage Worlds has got a great combat system, and it's fast, it's furious, it's going to be over fairly quickly. But it can still be very boring if I'm not involved in that combat and I'm sitting at the table just watching other people do this.
Well, that's true. But I agree if it's going to be a long, drawn-out thing. But if we're talking about a Star Wars thing, we're talking about an actual Star Wars-worthy duel. Like, we're talking the Obi-Wan Darth Vader duel. The other characters are running to the ship, so they're doing their own chase scene trying to get to the Millennium Falcon. I mean, you could break it up. You could make it a dramatic task where your Jedi involved in it just draws in regular combat like we've talked about, and then on his scene you jump to the duel. I understand the impetus to keep everybody involved at all times, but we're talking about a Star Wars duel that's probably going to be over within 5 rounds as a dramatic task, or fairly decently in a chase situation. I'm kind of okay with not pandering to every player's ADD at the table.
I was going to say the same thing. Sometimes
in certain situations.
And again, I think we're talking Star Wars here. So you've got 3 iconic duels that I think of. You've got the duel between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope.
Right.
This duel is not a combat. There is no combat involved other than the fact Obi-Wan gets cut down. They both test each other's defenses twice, and then Obi-Wan lets Darth Vader cut him in half. Mm-hmm. Spoilers if you haven't seen a 30-year-old movie.
Fuck spoilers.
I'm out. I can't believe you gave that away.
Another iconic duel is the one that Chris referenced that really reignited lightsaber duels for all of us, and that's the one in The Phantom Menace between Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan, and Darth Maul. And then the third duel I think of is the Darth Vader Luke duel in Return of the Jedi. The 2 end caps here, the one from Obi-Wan and Darth Vader and the one with Luke and Darth Vader, are very much ones I would run as a chase scene or as a dramatic task, something of that nature. The one with Qui-Gon Jinn, Darth Maul, and Obi-Wan,
combat.
That's 3 heroic or legendary level characters having a full-fledged combat on a grid map where you're going to go through all of that. But the thing is, all your player characters are at the table because while you're doing that combat, you also have Anakin rolling his combat rolls for the Starfighter, and you've got Padme and the other members of the party in the gun duel. You can run all of that simultaneously in Savage Worlds. Right. But in the moment with Darth Vader and Obi-Wan, the other players are off doing something completely different that really doesn't need any card rolls. There's no rounds going on as they run up the ramp to the Millennium Falcon. They're out of any effective combat at that point.
Oh, and the same thing applies if you look at The Empire Strikes Back, the lightsaber duel between Luke and Vader. Everybody's trying to catch Boba Fett before he takes off. Mm-hmm. Everybody's trying to get out of Cloud City. I think what I really want to just put forward here and really emphasize is not running a lightsaber duel as a combat, because a lightsaber duel is not about a combat. It's about two characters who are equally matched that are very likely no one's going to strike either one and do any real damage, but it's about a conflict and them having that kind of classic back and forth speech where a secret's revealed or something happens. And that's the point of a lightsaber duel in Star Wars, in the Star Wars universe. It's not about chopping somebody's hand off. That's just a straight up combat. And that's why we're saying when you go to do anything adaptation wise in Savage Worlds from any IP, you want to think about what's the mass effect of what we're trying to do. What is a combat or what is a lightsaber duel in Star Wars intended to be? What comes closest to matching it as far as the existing rule set in Savage Worlds?
No, and this one I'm going to throw mostly to Jib, having done more Deadlands than I have. When I think of like the Samurai duel or the classic Spaghetti Western duel, this is absolutely a duel where you expect somebody's going to be dead at the end of it. Right. You expect someone is dying. This is not a two masters who are equally, and we're just playing this out to see who walks away defeated but still walks away. In a Deadlands duel or in a Samurai duel, you're expecting someone's dead body crumpled on the ground at the end of it. I think that is also a major difference here that separates that type of duel from your classic Star Wars lightsaber duel, where most of the time both participants do walk away.
Right. I would agree. When you're talking about a gun duel or a samurai duel, you are thinking about somebody getting a case of dead at the end of it. And in the case of in either case, it can happen like right now, or you can have a protracted fight. It can go either way. That's kind of why my head went to the gunslinging rules in Deadlands as a way to approach that. There's a lot of corollary between the two events, philosophically speaking. I like the dramatic task idea. The dramatic task idea is also fun, especially if you want it to be more of a role-playing event than a combat event. I would certainly go that way.
So, let's say we're talking about Empire Strikes Back. We're talking about that duel. It's a dramatic task, and the player playing Luke draws a club and fails the roll. Darth Vader takes his hand. That could be the result, right? I mean, dramatically, you just lost your hand. Understanding that in the Star Wars universe, that means nothing permanently to the character.
Well, a couple of things. One, I think it does mean something to the character until they can pick up that cybernetic limb to replace it. They're not, they are absolutely going to be down a limb, at least for the remainder of the scene.
Right.
But the other thing I would point out is what you have just described, where a club comes up and the player botches the roll. If it's a dramatic task, that now has become a failed dramatic task. So Luke has absolutely lost the duel. Having his saber hand cut off seems an appropriate penalty. If it's just simply you failed a roll in the dramatic task, but we're going to have more rolls, I don't think it's as appropriate to have a botched roll result in something like that, because to me at least, there's a level of that seems disingenuous to the player having built this character. Is now suddenly one failed dice roll can do far more damage to their character avatar than any failed roll is ever meant to do in Savage Worlds.
All right. Well, it could be, but you can narrate it. You can narrate it any way you would like. The NPC uses the force powers to throw a bunch of shit at you that causes you to lose your turn this round. Vader throws his saber at your hiding space and brings you wrecking down to the ground in a crash.
Well, you can narrate any failed round of a dramatic task that doesn't end the task entirely in an appropriately negative light for the player character. But I would avoid having just a failed dice roll be a lost limb or a wound or anything of that nature, because
then it sounds like combat.
You save that for when they fail the entire thing.
And that's what I'm saying. You don't put so much weight on every dice roll within the task. It's when they fail the dramatic task, they get that wound, or they get that cut off limb, or they get knocked out of a window, their lightsaber gets shattered in half, whatever the appropriate major problem that comes out of
the worst possible thing happens. And that's what happens if you look at the protracted. I think The Empire Strikes Back is a good example we're talking about with the lightsaber duel as a dramatic task. It starts in the carbon freezing chamber. There's a lot of back and forth. That's one round of them striking lightsabers, taunting each other, talking to each other, Luke doing backflips away from Vader. Then it progresses into a hallway, and Vader's using Force Throw to throw shit at Luke. Then it progresses out onto that catwalk, and you get your final kind of scene of the dramatic task, and Luke fails the dramatic task. The hand comes off, and he learns the worst possible news he could possibly ever imagine getting in his entire life.
Well, another thing, and this is one that we've touched on a little bit at times that I don't think all the GMs and players really realize. A failed dramatic task does not necessarily mean the players failed at whatever was happening there. And a great example of this would be any of the scenes from Lethal Weapon where there's a bomb. The bomb always goes off. But the dramatic task is, do Riggs and Murtaugh survive it? In this scene, Luke can absolutely survive a lost duel as Jared said, really loses nothing because he picks up he goes and gets healed for the missing hand immediately right thereafter. The scene is called, you have that GM hand wave of, yes, all your wounds heal between that scene and the next scene. So we see Luke sitting there having the hand recalibrated. Those are great things that we can absolutely gamify and hand wave away, but there still has to be something there, and I think it's more the Luke, I'm your father moment, and then him falling out of Cloud City, causing them to have to rescue him from the precarious purge, where he has to make a series of agility rolls to grab hold of the edge, and then the force rolls to call his sister over to save him. I think that's more interesting when you look at it in terms of where would the dice rolls be to create the remainder of that scene as a failed dramatic task that is just him losing the duel but not dying.
Right.
So let's take another common thing from like a sci-fi franchise. Let's say, I want to play Savage Star Trek. Now, we're not going to go down this rabbit hole of creating racial variants for Vulcans and Tellarites and Andorians and, green-skinned Orion women. And go ahead. If you want to dial that in, there are race creation rules. Knock yourself out. What I want to talk about are like the very common, typical things that would come up. Like, well, wait a minute. How do you handle phasers? When somebody gets shot with a phaser.
Use the laser pistols from Deluxe with a stun setting.
Okay. Done. What if I want to set it to disintegrate? Because
so here's an interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't realize. That is nothing more than poison. That's the lethal poison that already exists in Savage Worlds.
Yeah, that would work.
It's a laser pistol with poison. Done. Make a roll. Did you survive the disintegration or not after he rolls to hit you?
Firefly. I just want to make sure we hit, because there seems to be a steady stream of at least 5 or 6 IPs that always get talked about for Savage Worlds. Oh, how would you bring this into Savage Worlds? And I think Firefly is always like a big, huge geek fan favorite. It's an nerdgasm. It seems like it's perfect for Savage Worlds, and well, it is. It is.
It's also a great source for a game.
Yeah. So, well, how do you handle Firefly? You just run core rules as written. Well,
exactly that.
do you update the weapons list? No.
Honestly, I'm using the weapons list out of the sci-fi companion for the bolt throwers, and that's it. You could use the one right out of core. Just pick a couple of handguns to have your players have access to, and a couple of rifles, and you really are pretty much done.
Well, how do you deal with languages? Like, because they know English, they know Chinese Mandarin. Okay, everybody does. Done.
I was going to say, Savage Worlds has a couple of decent rules on how you handle languages. One is you turn all languages into knowledge
skills. Mm-hmm.
And whatever your native language, you automatically speak in a D12. You automatically have that capacity to communicate with others in your native language. You're going to make these knowledge dice skills to communicate in another language, and the GM can kind of play by ear and go, okay, well, he got a success, so you get most of what he said, but it's in a really heavy accent. He got a couple raises, you know exactly right down to the detail. He used all the perfect words for complex instruction. So Savage Worlds has some rules for that. Savage Worlds also has a really great setting rule that just basically does away with it and says everyone speaks all languages, or there's a babblefish in your ear, or whatever the common translator trope of the game is. Or
characters. There's a multilingual rule in Savage Worlds that says characters automatically know up to half of their smart sign languages.
So there's a couple of different ways you can handle languages. I think most interestingly, though, what we're doing for my Monday night game, and I know Jared has done this in games in the past, is circulate a document very similar to that page in ETU that says, here are some common Southern phrases. Here are some common Serenity Firefly phrases. If players use those, get an extra Benny.
Yep.
Especially if your player goes to the extent of trying to pronounce the Chinese.
But Dave, I need to create a new brown coat hindrance.
Do you? I mean, really, do you? Or is that just the wanted hindrance? Or the outcast hindrance?
So it could be outsider. I can just use outsider with anybody who's alliance and not brown coat.
No, that's too easy.
Interesting.
Okay, so here's the dead horse. Here's us beating it. Trapping.
Which brings me to a listener email. Funny how that segue thing worked out. How would Bill Lear ask? How would you tone down magic, i.e., trappings, so that boost trait only affects a specific trait and make it still worth buying it as an advance? Number one, I wouldn't tone down trappings or boost trait. I wouldn't change anything to do with making boost traits particularly selective. Unless we're talking about something like stims, like you can if you have like a drug or a slap pad for healing, things like that. I would make it boost vigor by die type when you use it.
I think an interesting aspect of that is boost lower trait in and of itself does both. Most GMs automatically will say you take one or the other when they want to really reduce the power of it. And I think that in and of itself kind of already breaks that power a little bit. You really are taking a lot of capability out of the player's hands just by making them choose either to boost or lower, not having the freedom to do both. I really don't think you need to take it away from the player in any way.
Yeah, I don't think that you really need to worry about eliminating powers in any Savage Worlds game at all. If magic isn't highly prevalent and you're not kind of dealing with a weird science element, you're not worried about technology being at different levels or whatever, to where technology is almost magic to some species. If the tech level is pretty much level, like in a Star Wars game, the technology, there's so many different variants of technology, but it's all kind of on the same level playing field. With lightsabers, blasters, sentient machines, the whole 9 yards, it's all pretty much just there. Technology is ubiquitous in Star Wars, and it's there for trappings more than anything. I mean, how practical is a plasma sword? Not at all. That's incredibly dangerous, but goddamn, it looks cool when you ignite it, and damn, it looks cool when doing slash. And that's the point of the lightsaber.
I guess, though, and I'm just going to shoot from the hip here. I'm going to assume Bill is talking about a universe maybe more like Mass Effect from the video games, where you've got some characters who have these psionic abilities that no one else has, and they're very limited. And I think from that angle, if what you're doing, then what you need to do, instead of limiting what boost lower trait can affect, you need to dial all the way back to the point of creating an arcane background that specifically fits your world. And take a note out of like what they did in Deadlands for the Blessed. The Blessed are supposed to be these very powerful casters, but they've got some pretty severe restrictions. A failed dice roll reduces their skill by a die type, and until they come back around to to get that back up, they have to go through a whole process to reinvigorate that. Take a look at some of the existing arcane backgrounds that are out there that already limit. The Blessed has a very specific spell list, and you'll notice there's no direct damage combat spells available to the Blessed at all.
Nope, not at all.
The Huckster, by comparison, has very specific direct damage spells, but has a pretty big, nasty tail end to that, both in RP and also just in the other parts of the mechanic.
And if you have that player who doesn't necessarily want that restriction, have some edges, because they have conviction in Deadlands for the Blessed, which takes away that penalty of being able to cast that one level higher and take that minus. It takes that penalty away. So you're having that penalty in there, but if they want to get rid of that penalty, it's taking an advance.
Yeah.
Well, I would also say this too. I mean, I just want to cling closer to the core. I know we've talked about some stuff from Deadlands. If you want to kind of say, hey, you know what, we have psionics as a big thing in our universe. Let's say we're doing the Mass Effect thing, and it's a psionics thing. Just relabel your particular brand of psionics as arcane background superpower, and that way they spend advances for the power as a die type skill, which would basically do exactly what Bill is talking about. It would make boost lower trait a more progressive and slow building power set, and you don't deal with backlash and stuff with superpowers as the arcane background, because it either works or it doesn't.
Yeah, the interesting thing with going that route is, instead of having to say, well, this can only affect vigor, and you have to take a second version to affect agility or another version to affect shooting. Now Boost Lower Trait does everything it used to do, but you only get it at a D4 until you start spending those skill points to increase it.
Right.
So it absolutely, I think, has the same net effect on your game of controlling the power level of a player who takes magic without, having to really take away the capacity of the powers. The powers in Savage Worlds are very broad for a very big reason. They're meant to only affect the mechanics of the game and leave these things up to the player to come up with a way to describe in the game.
Right, and despite the popular perception, powers do not cause the system to be highly unbalanced. They are not an imbalancing proposition like they are in other role-playing games.
Play powers properly with power points and make your players actually keep track of that refresh rate. And you will find that powers are almost a way for that player to make themselves less powerful.
Right. And I like the idea of, I like the thing we were talking about with superpowers for Boost Lower Trait, because it controls the progression, the speed of the progression. The character has to really dedicate advances to it, but they can get as high as a D12 and it doesn't feel punitive to the player. Like, oh, I see, you're nerfing powers because you're a dick GM. Way to go. Nice. I wanted to play a power-based character, but I guess I can't play it in your universe because you're going to limit me to one trait that I can boost. This is bullshit, man.
Well, the other thing that it achieves, and it's a secondary aspect of that superpowers arcane background, if you take arcane background magic and you buy a D8 at start, and then you immediately level that up, and you're going to take that to a D10 the first advance, a D12 the second advance. You don't care about the fact you're paying a whole advance for one skill increase because you've gone above your derived stat. Now you've got a D12 spellcasting for the duration of your campaign. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if that's the bolt power, the blast power, the puppet power. You have a D12 spellcasting. With this, you might have gotten Boost Lower Trait to a D12, but now you have to raise Puppet on its own from a D4. Right. You don't automatically get, just by spending an additional edge or an additional advance, a whole new power that casts at a D12. You are, again, restricted on how good you are with that power. So superpowers really does fix a lot of what people feel is the runaway power of that. But again, right. I really do think if people look just at PowerPoints, especially if you get a player who wants to take, you use the Born a Hero rule, and a player says, well, great, I'm going to take my novice adventurer with the puppet power, because they can do that under Born a Hero. You absolutely can, but you're going to blow all your power points at novice to basically cast that once.
So let's talk about this as well, because there are arcane backgrounds in Savage Worlds. We're going to do it in Star Wars. Jedi should be arcane background, superpower. Cross that with a marker that says Jedi. I mean, you could just as easily call that Jedi superpower. Puppet is the Obi-Wan Kenobi mind trick. These aren't the droids you're looking for. Okay, give me a smarts roll against his D4 puppets. Okay, I guess these aren't the droids we're looking for. You could take telekinesis. Really, you could just pretty much trap. All Jedi powers is telekinesis, pretty much. And I think we've had that discussion.
Oh, yeah, we've talked about that. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, so, heal, puppet, any of those powers you could pick up, and if you want to just let the players say, hey, we're playing Star Wars, ignore rank restrictions for powers, but we're going to use the superpower companion, or the superpower arcane background, and you would have a very easily well-balanced kind of Jedi to the other characters, if you're concerned with that.
I just want to point out, Jared's not talking about the superpowers companion version of superpowers. He's specifically talking about the core rules, Street Fighter level superpowers that's right in core. Now, with that said, I would say you could easily do that also with Miracles. Miracles has the whole thing in there about having to follow a dogmatic code, and you could have both the Sith and the Jedi be just, arcane background Miracles, and their code of conduct that they have, the Jedi code and the Sith code, can determine what's a sin and what isn't, what causes them to have to atone, things of that nature. There's a lot of different directions you can go with it. I would base it more on what do you want your game to focus on. In a game where I'm going to focus a lot more on bombastic combat, I'm probably going to push my players toward superpowers and have them all take telekinesis, and then they can pick up heal or bolt if they want to have a more obscure power like lightning or healing. But telekinesis does most of the stuff a Jedi is going to handle. But if I'm going to be focusing more on the narrative, if I'm going to be focusing a lot on non-Jedi combat, where there's going to be a lot of proselytizing, they're talking about the code, you're having a lot of scenes where they're standing around in the Jedi Temple, absolutely, it's arcane background Miracles, because then the code matters more in your role play, and you want to give them that opportunity to play with that mechanically as well.
Plus, if you give them arcane background Miracles, you open up the adept edge. You open up a lot of combat-related edges that go along with the Miracles thing, kind of like the idea of the D&D Paladin.
Yeah, like the champion edge. You could throw that in there.
Mm-hmm. Champion, adept, things like that would all come into play if you're using arcane background Miracles.
Champion works great because now you've got a specific edge for facing off against Sith, or if you're a Sith, a specific edge for facing off against Jedi.
So let's talk like mechanically speaking. Well, okay, how do you do force push? It's telekinesis, push. Opposed by opponent's strength. Done. That's it. The rule's already there for a push. It's the same thing, except now if you're using the arcane background superpowers, you got a D10 telekinesis. That's your strength of your telekinesis.
You could also just use pummel.
Pummel would work as well. Yeah.
Yep.
So there's a more than one way to skin the proverbial cat to get to what you want to get to. So we've kind of really beaten the shit out of Star Wars with this stick. Kind of touched on Firefly. Is there another adaptation or IP that you guys hear players wanting to adapt a lot, or asking what would be a good?
Well, there's the King, D&D. I swear I can't count the number of times you see somebody say, "How do I play D&D in Savage Worlds?"
First off, you don't.
Yeah, you go and you play that in 5th edition.
Pick up the preferred edition and play that if you really want the D&D mechanics, especially if you're going to go down the fancy and magic hole.
Because Savage Worlds just has a completely different feel.
Well,
it's a mechanically different animal.
Richard Woolcock has gone to bat and continually defended his version of Fancy and Magic for Savage Worlds. And I will say this, it's not necessarily a bad system if you want to add that level of additional bookkeeping and stuff to your game. The problem is it doesn't feel like Fancy and Magic and D&D because it's still Savage Worlds at core. You just aren't going to capture that. So I highly recommend, if that's specifically the thing you want to play, D&D captures it better. But at the same time, stop letting yourself be boxed into thinking that you have to play it the same way.
Right.
You can tell a great fantasy story in Savage Worlds with no changes. And then there are some fantasy settings out there that make some pretty drastic changes to carte blanche fantasy.
Yeah.
So wait, Dave, what you're saying is, if we're going to use an analogy, D&D is chess, Savage Worlds is checkers.
No.
D&D is Coca-Cola, and Savage Worlds is Coca-Cola, and D&D is Shasta or Royal Crown. They're both colas, but they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's a much better...
And so let me throw this. I know we're trying to keep close to core, but let me throw this out there. that if there are people out there who just have to find some sort of conversion doc,
Okay.
two places, Savagepedia and Savage Heroes.
Mm-hmm.
I just went to Savage Heroes and I just pulled up the Firefly RPG PDF. It's a 27-page PDF. And one of the funny things is the first new hindrance listed is Brown Coat Major.
Yeah. See, okay, so here's why I'm against fan conversions. Here's why I'm against fan conversions. Having done one for Star Wars myself, I'm against my own Star Wars fan conversion. I will just come out right now and tell you that. I think there's some interesting mechanical ideas in it as far as dark side corruption and some other things I have woven into it. There's some interesting ways to do duels, but everything's way overcomplicated for Savage Worlds. And that's what you end up getting a lot of the times, even with a well-meant and dedicated fan writing a conversion document.
Yeah, I mean,
it's going to be, you can take half of it and just go, nope, not needed. Because it comes down to trappings. People take edges and hindrances and these mechanics very literally instead of just going, well, what already exists in the book? Push already exists in the book. What already exists for power, for strength, telekinesis? Okay, well, there's how we do a force push. Done. And you'll see a lot of stuff with hindrances and edges being played with that are really just, I would say, slight tweaks on existing edges and hindrances where you could just as easily say, hey, consider trappings and we're done.
Yeah.
Just consider trappings and we're done. I've got the Firefly conversion that of which Chris speaks of. It's not bad. I mean, it's not bad, and it's a labor of love. I'm not going to shit all over the person who created it and go, there it is.
You've plugged fan conversions on the show before. I can't count the number of times that you guys keep telling people to go grab the Ghostbusters one because it does such a good job of capturing Ghostbusters. But again, at first blush, if you're fairly adept with the Savage Worlds rule set, you don't need it. And I think that's more what this is about. Is not, we're not trying to say these are bad any more than we're trying to say the sci-fi companion or the superpowers companion or Shane Tar or ETU are bad. We're just saying if you know what you're trying to achieve in a particular thing and you're adept with the rules, you don't need the other book to achieve it.
Right. Core will handle it. And this also comes down to creating the occasional homebrew, what we would back in the day call a homebrew setting rule or a house rule for Savage Worlds. If you intend to have a very high action type, let's say you're doing Die Hard, for example, you may want to just say, hey, you know what? I know that Savage Worlds has cover modifiers against ranged attacks. Why is it that a running character who's running doesn't get a range modifier bonus? They should. Well, if you expect your characters to do a lot of running through battlefields and shit, go ahead and just say, hey, here's a house rule. Speed is armor. And range attacks suffer -1, additional -1 against range attacks against the running character. I mean, done. You don't need to find a conversion. You're not going to find that in a Die Hard conversion, like Savage Die Hard or whatever, unless, somebody puts that together, puts it out there. But it's about capturing the tropes and understanding how those tropes translate to a mechanical effect, and then just picking up and looking at the core rules and going, oh, okay, there's already a rule for that. Chances are, if you look at any of these conversion documents that you see on the internet, if you really study them and you're really familiar with Savage Worlds core, you can eliminate 75% of the document. You go, oh, that's just habit reworded. Mm-hmm. Why do I need a reputation mechanic?
Well, and a good example, if you're wanting to write a conversion document, pull out a full setting book like ETU, like Deadlands, and look at what they add in those.
Right.
You might see one or two where they've taken an edge and renamed it. I know, I believe Anemic becomes Aelin for Deadlands to capture the theme. That's a trappings change. They don't change the mechanic of the edge at all. But then you're going to have some new edges and hindrances that do get added, but they're going to be things like Second Fiddle from ETU, which doesn't exist anywhere in core. So it is a new mechanic to a certain extent, and it does add something to the game. That should be where you're looking at your setting, Star Wars, Star Trek, whatever, and looking at what does that setting have that is specific to it that you need a new mechanic for, rather than just, oh, well, they're Jedi, so I must need a brand new Arcane background called Jedi.
Right. Well, and here's the other thing, too. Let's talk, let's say we're going to do Scooby-Doo. We're going to adapt Scooby-Doo to Savage Worlds. Do I need to come up with a race for Talking Dog? I mean, do I? No. That would be ludicrous. For all intent and purposes, Scooby-Doo is no different from a character build standpoint than Shaggy, Velma, or any of the other members of that gang. Other than he may have like Outsider because he's a dog.
Can't speak really well, so he has a speech impediment. Maybe add that as a quirk and make the player talk in the Scooby-Doo voice. Has 4 paws instead of 2 hands.
Right, so maybe he has fleet. Maybe he automatically starts with the fleet-footed edge.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you just pick up dog from the bestiary and use that as an archetype, a starting archetype for novice, and let the character build advances onto it as if they were a wild card.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a number of ways you could do it. You don't have to go to great lengths to convert Scooby-Doo to Savage Worlds. I mean, the same thing holds true for Star Wars. C-3PO. To be a wild card, just use the construct race. Done. You're just done. You don't need to overcomplicate it with, he's got gimbals and so many weapon slot mods and memory modules and complex. Well, how does he know? 6 million languages? Who gives a shit? It's trappings. So C-3PO just understands every language that's spoken and speaks every language that's spoken. Done. He doesn't need a smarts roll to understand Jabba the Hutt. He just understands Jabba the Hutt. It's just a conceit of the setting. Like, it's the whole, what is it? I would almost call it geek-splaining, where you take a look, like somebody who's not a fan of Star Wars, for example, may go, wait a minute. Okay, hold on a second. So we got this Han Solo guy, right? Yeah, okay. And he speaks English. Yeah, uh-huh. Now he's got this huge Wookiee friend of his that hangs out. But I never hear Han speak Wookiee. And I never hear the Wookiee speak anything like English other than Wookiee. How do they know what each other is saying?
Well, it's simple.
Now, this is geek-splaining. Here comes geek-splaining.
Here comes the geek-splaining.
Because I'm going to tell you, George Lucas never considered it, and if somebody asked George Lucas, he would have waved his hand and said, Chaffa. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Carry on.
I understand, but I understand, and we understand this too, because it's the West End gamer goes to the thing of like, okay, well, Wookiees don't have the vocal cords to form human language. They can understand human language, and obviously Han understands Sharuk, but doesn't speak it because he doesn't have the vocal cords. There's this rationalization and post-explanation that follows something that was never intended to be that complex in the first place.
Right.
So I think a lot of that happens on the Savage World side of the fence with GMs trying to adapt the setting. They try to get this logical verisimilitude approach to something that was meant as a hand wave trapping because it's fucking cool.
Well,
that's why.
that's really kind of the moment. I mean, yeah, I can provide an explanation for how that works, which is pretty much just what you said. However, the real question is, why does it matter?
Yeah, who cares?
It's
a trapping.
Decide what matters for your game mechanically and what matters for your game narratively. And if it's narrative, handle it with trappings.
Yep. Let me check the email real quick, see if we have any more questions.
And by the way, C3PO would just have the linguist edge, which lets him start with, half his smarts in languages, and then it's a simple smarts at -2 to understand a new language. So,
yeah, or you can just hand wave it completely. You can just say, "Hey, he's a communication droid. He's got that communication package. He's done. He's a protocol droid. He's just done. There we go." Yeah, don't try to get too verisimilitude when you start talking about trying to do adaptations. Like, really capture. There's also like a great supplement for pulp by Triple Ace Games. There's a great supplement for space and cyberpunk. They're free supplements, and they will give you some basic ideas like I think they call it heroic combat, I think is what they call it, in being that at the end of any combat scene, everybody just automatically recovers 1 wound. Done. And they get a Benny every time they go to enter a combat. Just because. Because they're big damn heroes. Why? Because they're the big damn heroes of the seating. That's why.
Yeah, and that's just the Daring Tales line. It's like Daring Tales of Adventure, Daring Tales of Chivalry, of the Space Lanes, of the Sprawl, and all of those, if you go to their website, are free.
Yep.
It's only when you start getting into like their adventure packs you have to actually buy anything, and then it's adventures specifically designed to be run in that. And each one's 4 or 5 pages long typically.
Yeah.
I think the biggest one might be 12 pages, and it quite literally is a very streamlined set of these are the only setting rules you need for this entire genre.
Like, okay, so let's talk real quick. I'm not a big Xbox gamer, so I'm not intimately familiar with Mass Effect, but I've heard it brought up. So, what are the core tenets narratively or thematically of Mass Effect? Let's see if we can slap some core rule knowledge onto that framework as an example.
Never played the game.
Yeah, I was going to say I haven't played it.
Mass Effect is really quite simple to explain. It's carte blanche, Star Wars, Star Trek-y style, space operatic, but the two big things that are outside the norm, everyone's a human unless you are actively going to let your players play the other races they run into, in which case, even then, they're still human. They've got a few hindrances maybe that color them differently, but in very Star Trek-esque style, all the races that they run into are bipedal. They all walk upright.
Okay.
They all talk. They're very much a variation on humans. Some are much bigger, but regardless, they all carry around guns and things like that. But then you have 2 arcane backgrounds, one being psionics, one being what they call tech ops, which would just really be like either
science
or magic, and then the other being weird science. And it would be very straightforward to handle that one. I really don't think that requires anything that doesn't already exist in Core or the Sci-Fi Companion.
Okay.
It's unfortunately, it's boilerplate sci-fi that the nerds have gone really over the top, overboard about, because it had a great story. It wasn't anything groundbreaking as far as sci-fi is concerned.
Okay. So let's talk real quick then about like spaceship battles, because I know regardless of what flavor you're going to adapt for sci-fi, that always comes into play as a question. Do we do units of measure? Do we use vehicle rules? How do we handle this? I don't know what to do. And I'm gonna say this: if we're talking about Star Wars as another example, I would say even Star Trek to a degree. Starship combat is never about combat. It's always about something that leads to a dramatic point. Well, I will say this. Let me back up. In Star Trek, in the Star Trek universe, spaceship combat is never about this tactical brinksmanship. It is not a game of chess played between the Romulans and the Federation or whatever. It is strictly there for rating boost. It is supposed to look fucking spectacular, and it is supposed to be exciting, and you should be able to hear, you should see fire in space, which is not possible. You should also hear the sound of aircraft, spaceship flying by, which no sound in space. So the whole point of a starship combat, especially in Star Trek, is a plot hook that leads to the next scene. Oh, now the Enterprise is damaged, and we're outnumbered and outgunned. Oh, God, how do we play out the rest of this narratively? How do we trick Khan and survive? It's never about, in my opinion at least, it's never about combat. It's about drama.
Depending on if you're doing one of the original TV show or original movie scenes, where I would say it's absolutely just a dramatic task, whereas if you're doing like the most recent movie where they've actually got boarding parties and things like that happening, I think there you could actually go mass combat. I think either way, abstracting that, if you're not going to hand wave it entirely, I think abstracting it is the way to go.
Right. So let's say the most recent Star Trek Beyond, that is a total mass combat with individual character actions as the boarding party. The big battle in Return of the Jedi, another mass combat. Capital ships versus other ships, basic mass combat.
See, I don't even know if I run the mass combat on that one. I think I just run the chase scene that involves the Millennium Falcon,
the fighters,
and the X-wing running through the trench into the center of the Death Star. While I'm running a separate scene for the ground crew to get out and finish mopping up with the Ewoks and whatnot. I think that's a much more direct to what the players are doing. The players don't give two shits what's going on with the capital ships.
Right.
And a bad dice roll where the capital ships suddenly have to bug out, and now your players are just cut off with no way to escape. You know, I think you have to be very careful with these massive elements that can, in all reality, screw the pooch for your
story. Yeah.
Your players have suddenly become a side note in the fact that the Alliance lost the war because you made a couple of mass combat rolls while they were in the midst of their chase scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think that when it comes to sci-fi, almost every major, and I was a big fan of the FASA Star Trek Starfleet battles when it was a game, because it was literally a grid chess game. It had nothing to do with telling a story about the Star Trek universe. It was all about tactics and movement and tactics and everything else. That's a separate thing completely. I would almost say that if you're going to adapt Star Wars into Savage Worlds, I would just go ahead and use the Hero Clicks, WizKids space battle game with the miniatures the way they exist, just to run that out if you want to.
Or
at
the new
table.
Fantasy Flight version they've got one that's Starfighters, they've got one that's Starfleets. You can tell it at the micro or the macro level. And they've got full box sets. You can play that out in a matter of 10, 15 minutes and be done.
Right.
I was actually going to say, back when I first came to Savage Worlds, I was a big fan of BattleTech. And I wanted to bring BattleTech to Savage Worlds. And I tried multiple times. And you know what? At this point, I very easily could tell a BattleTech story in Savage Worlds. But it would be Savage Worlds. It wouldn't be BattleTech. It would just be the BattleTech universe.
Right.
Something I learned very early on, and I throw this even back to when FAFSA released their own MechWarrior role-playing game is you can't take a tabletop war game and translate it one for one into a role-playing game because they are not designed to play the same way. A role-playing game requires a micro-combat look at things. A tabletop war game requires a macro combat look at things. You're looking at the entire battlefield, which can be the size of a planet, versus the entire battlefield being the size of this room that we're fighting in.
I would totally agree with that. And that's one reason why I think the mass battle rules in Savage Worlds work so well, particularly if you intersperse them with other scenes.
Yes.
If you do it just like
abstracts that other thing you can't really
do. Round, like, mass combat round, mass combat round, mass combat round, mass combat round, mass combat round. It's like, okay, whatever. But if you do a mass combat round that leads into a role-playing scene, that leads into a mass combat round, that leads into a small arms fight, that leads into a mass combat round, and everything impacts the thing that comes after it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes for a very dramatic sequence.
Be aware, when you start trying to use mass combat in Savage Worlds, it can end after the very first round. Mass combat
is very deadly.
It's not just about how deadly it is, because it absolutely, like, if you have a player character who decides they're going to take individual action, they can catch a case of dead on a success. It requires 2 raises before the player character escapes unscathed.
Hold on, because we're talking about mass combat rules, like everybody's familiar with the rule, and that may not be the case. So, in the example, let's say the first Star Wars movie, Luke Skywalker going up against the trench, how does that look as a mass combat? Because the Death Star is coming in around the corner of the planet. We're on a countdown. There's all kinds of TIE fighters flying around. Y-Wings, there's, everybody's involved in this battle. That's all fodder, basically to give Luke a chance to get into the trench. So, the mass combat is what you run for, oh shit, the rebels just lost half of their fucking fleet. Meanwhile, in the trench, so Luke is taking an individual piloting action during that mass combat to get into the trench and drop the bomb down the sphere. If he fails that roll, he can get hit and take 4d6 damage to his X-Wing in Savage Worlds.
Yeah. And
give a huge boost bonus to the Imperial side on their next mass combat roll.
So the big thing with mass battles is the dice roll comes at the end of a mass battle round, not the beginning. Individual actions happen before it. And the actual roll you're making is a morale roll for the most part. You're making first a knowledge battle roll. How well did your army execute its plan? Which then determines the modifier to the morale roll of does your army stay and fight? Because you make that first roll, both sides remove tokens, and then you make the second roll based on how many tokens you lost and how many you have versus the opposing army. So a mass battle, very much outside of the individual action. If no player takes an individual action, you just make a knowledge battle roll. That knowledge battle roll removes some tokens. You can have a morale roll that instantly ends that mass battle in a rout right then and there. On that first dice roll, you have to be aware of that when you start saying, we're going to start interspersing this into an elongated scene where I'm going to have 4 separate rounds of mass battle. Well, you might get to that 4th round of the mass battle, and the mass battle doesn't end because the other side hasn't been routed and your side hasn't been routed. Because of that abstract nature, you can't play too hard structure-wise with it. You have to be willing to kind of go kind of fast and loose. If you want a bigger structure, that's where you start looking at dramatic tasks, chase scenes, things like that, where you can set a specific end point. We're going to go for 5 rounds.
Right. And what Jib is describing with interspersing, to use an example, the Battle of Endor. You have this huge space battle going on over the forest moon. That's the mass combat. That's all the capital ships blasting at each other. You also have a dramatic task. Yeah, well, you also have a dramatic task taking place at the same time with Lando in the Falcon trying to get inside, bring down the Death Star. On the planet's surface, you could have another mass combat between the Ewoks and the Imperials, while you have interspersed role-playing scenes with the main characters trying to achieve objectives that add bonuses to the mass combat, but don't necessarily involve them in the... Well, it could involve them in the mass combat, or you could run it as completely separate narrative scenes.
And your players have that option to take that risk to get involved, and a player who gets involved adds a pretty hefty bonus to their side on a success.
Right. So bringing down the Hand's team, bringing down the shield generator, gives a huge mass bonus to the combat that's going on in orbit for the rebel side of the conflict. And like we're talking about, it's very abstract, and you have to be able to kind of step back and look at the big picture when you're talking about a mass combat.
Yeah.
Okay, so don't take things too literally in adaptation. Remember, trappings are your friend. Before you try to create a complex rule or conversion, take a look at Savage Worlds and see what already works and steal it for what you're trying to do. The whole idea behind Savage Worlds, other than it being very fast to play at the table, is it is supposed to be very easy to use and create settings and things with it. As a GM, you don't need to sit there and invest 2,000 hours in writing a setting document. The idea should be, hey, the rules are here, they're quick, they're fast enough, you should be able to come up with a setting and ideas for it in 30 minutes, clock ticking, go. And the game will support you.
A 30-page setting document, and you want to do that, go ahead.
Sure, if that's your passion, you want to do the PDF layout, make it fancy, and give it away for free as a PDF. Hey, the fan community will thank you. Just slap a fan logo on there. Pinnacle will support you in saying, hey, absolutely.
I would focus, if you're going to go that route, I would focus on things like fluff, gear lists, NPC, a good bestiary. Those are things that are going to be more important than a bunch of additional mechanics. I would say that's where the really good fan conversions out there really nail it, is they give you, well, here's the stats for a proton pack, so the GM doesn't have to come up with those on the fly. Here's the stats for 12 different types of ghosts, so that the GM doesn't have to come up with that on the fly. That's the stuff that I think the community is really going to embrace and appreciate more than here's an elongated, 20-page treatise on how do I do Vancian magic in Savage Worlds, or
right.
How do I handle hanging from the back of a horse versus hanging from a gallows.
Right. And the other thing that you could do, too, if you're going to assume authorship of such a said conversion, is go ahead and give examples of how the core rules work for a specific situation in your IP or in that IP. So, for example, if you're writing a Ghostbusters, you should have a section in that conversion called Ghostbusting. Here's how it works. It's a dramatic task. It's a cooperative dramatic task. Run it like this. Here's an example. Don't cross the beams. Things like, here's what happens if you cross the beams. So it's just thinking ahead of, here's the things that are particular to this setting, the trope that we're trying to adapt, finding a rule that exists that fits, and then if you're going to make a conversion out of it, explaining it to the reader so they have a clear understanding of, so a force push is just nothing more than a telekinetic strength die type roll against the opponent's strength, and every success pushes them back an inch or sends them prone. Awesome. Done. Now I understand it. Oh, wait. Capital ships, we're going to run. Here's another thing you can do real quick. If we're talking about capital ships versus TIE fighters, what you're really talking about is a difference in scale. Go ahead and use the monstrous size chart for Savage Worlds and understand that a capital ship suffers a negative or a capital ship is a big, big target, and an X-Wing is a tiny, tiny target compared to an Imperial Star Destroyer. So the X-Wing gets +4 to hit the big gargantuan target, and the big gargantuan target suffers a penalty to hit the tiny little X-Wing. Done. So we're just saying there's things that exist in Savage Worlds that will fit any IP, any situation. Find them, adapt them, enjoy the game. With that, we're coming close on to 8:20. I think we're going to do Pimp It, very quickly, very briefly. We'll start with Chris. You get one. Pimp it.
Savage Cast. Go give us a listen.
Hashtag pussy grab. No, wait, that's completely wrong. That's completely wrong. Dave, pimp it.
It's a website called Gamelin Games. Just do a Google search. Bullet-shaped dice. Great to take with you to a con to hand out as free wild dice, especially when you're running any game that includes gunplay.
Hashtag Trumpopoulos. Jim.
Happy Jack's RPG Podcast. Listen, you know you got to.
Hashtag Stew Crew. I'm just adding hashtags on tonight. And then finally for us, hashtag oh please. Go ahead and subscribe to SWGM Podcast on Facebook. We have the same handle on Facebook as we have on Twitter, SWGM Podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe to iTunes. And until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Jib, Dave, and Chris saying keep rolling and stay savage.